Disney villains are an important piece when it comes to both my channel and Disney itself. They are the spice that brings these stories to life, that gives us reason to fight for good against well-designed dastardly foes that our heroes must face. And in recent times, it hasn't been the best for them in terms of storytelling content or featured in anything that Disney likes to do, and only mediocrely returning in recent films like Wish with Magnifico. But with that point said, I want to say that there is an interesting shift in the winds in recent days that speak favorably to the importance of such villains, even if the announcements aren't specifically referencing any type of movie that you might say, or any particular foes, and more so in their parks. Because as some of you know, I recently attended D23, the ultimate Disney fan event back in Anaheim for the Walt Disney Company near Disneyland, where they show off their newest biggest adventures and celebrate the illustrious past of that very company. Something I really enjoyed and want to discuss with you in very detail for the next few videos on my channel, beginning this month as a benchmark for all things to come and eventually look back upon the next time around. Which, as most people obviously would hear, especially in the case of this video, would actually pertain to be the biggest welcome surprise announcement of a Villains Land coming to the Magic Kingdom at Walt Disney World. Something most people have been pondering and clamoring for a very long time at this point, especially someone like me who has again praised classical Disney villains more so than the heroes themselves. It represents a step in the right direction for Disney in terms of what they've been planning. Where yes, there are still various issues with the company that most of us will have gripes with, including these own announcements with the park, and that criticism is not going away anytime soon, including with what other plans they have to actually make something like a Villains Land of both movies and theme parks, but how we recognize the great value that villains have as a whole that is giving us a new breath of fresh air to Disney, where even a land is something that really brings the Disney feeling back that most of us feel like the modern era has sorely been missing, especially by the company overall, even if I focus on animation. So in this video, we will be once again comparing the animated movies of what these animated villains have been featured in, and the ones in the past and the future, and the promise of this new entire land and the future movies. Where just to be clear, this isn't a video that is 100% certain on these types of characters that are come in future Disney films that are of course mostly sequels and of course speculation of what is to see, but a dedication of recognizing such characters to be enjoyed by audiences around the globe who come to places like Disney that they're still able to create, and especially the fact it's coming to a theme park which they need to care for. But then again, let's start things off talking about this Villains Land announcement. It was something that aired at the tail end of the D23 Horizons panel presented by Disney Experiences chairman Josh D'Amaro, quoting, "This new land will be home to the Disney villains we know and loathe from our favorite Walt Disney Animation Studios classic films," which means Happily Ever After may feel just like a distant dream. With of course the emphasis on that last quote is the part of the statement that says the villains we know and loathe from the classical films, and how that is the bigger thing to take away from this incredibly delicious presentation of the darkness coming to meet the light in the epic battle we've seen for well over a century, that we're returning to that classical evil element. And the statement online continues saying, "The evil ambition of all these villains means the possibilities are endless for stories that can be told," emphasis on stories that can be told, and visitors to the dark and thorny land should be prepared for whatever chaos might come their way. Included with a clip posted by Disney themselves of the Villains Land announcement showcasing a plethora of villains who represent pure evil that we all know and love when it comes to our definition of what a Disney villain entails, from the likes of Maleficent, Ursula, Jafar, and even the mediocre Magnifico with Madam Men and even the Horned King, also including Yzma. This whole stacked cast of our favorite devilish foes mainly shows us the true angle that they are going for right here. You see it in the concept art itself within their own words that paints a dark brooding picture with multiple thorns poking out and a twisted castle hanging on a curved wobbly rock formation as Maleficent's own dragon breathes green fire down from above near the cool water features and the dark mysterious town on the side below. Of course, this is all still concepts that people will wait and see for what comes out of it, but nevertheless, it still is very exciting with what has been said thus far. A new fresh start for villains coming to Disney in a grand way, which I believe represents the great turning point and the great comeback as stated in the title of this video for villains overall, with what we've been seeing slowly creeping back into the hallowed halls of the Walt Disney Company after they've been forgotten for nearly a decade. Because as we all know, talking about it constantly on this channel, Disney slowly turned the ship away from big classical villains starting after Frozen back in 2013, with a mixed bag of twist villains like Hans and so forth after doing something great with the concept in terms of King Candy Turbo that still worked in its traditional sense. That we decided to enter this weird era of a group of characters who seemed to be good until the very last second, which contradicts some of their ultimate motivations compared to the similar lit red herring type of characters who appeared to be the main villains but actually became worthless soul side pieces who can't help themselves at all and are also somehow voiced by Alan Tudyk. Doing things for the shock value of it all, and of course not making sense to the real logical reasons that these characters even existed in the first place, not providing any story for them since that was not the entire intention. Well, maybe for some since they all did it successively, but still not good enough when you look back upon the movies today and compare them to their past. I mean, in the middle of all this, you still had films like Moana that still had a group of foes and villains divided into many different parts that worked great on its own, like the Kakamora, who are also returning in the sequel as a good point of a group of challenging foes, and Tamatoa being a highlight while Tekao was a main threat in their own place, but how after that, they just dropped doing that completely, having this period of no real villains starting in the sequels with Ralph Breaks the Internet and Frozen 2, where they just disappeared off the face of the earth. Not that all Disney films even had ones if you consider some of the movies in the past like the package films, but for the most part, each main full-length feature film that they had done in the past did include a singular villain in some way. And these two big ones, which were the main sequels produced ever since The Rescuers Down Under, just scrapped that idea entirely, disappearing off the face of the earth. Sure, there were elements of antagonistic forces, but they hardly even mattered to the current plot at hand or the ideas that were currently presented, and even were put upon by the heroes themselves like Ralph to have such elements, which disappointed. Even when they tried to appear to have one threat back, they immediately pulled that straight from our expectations to redeem the hero just like Raya in this weird story with the trust issue that leaned way too hard one way rather than the other balance that the story needed that Namaari could have actually been in that place. Where the next film in Encanto also did not have a straight villain other than the pressure that Alma Magical put upon her own family for protection, which to be fair in this case is a more understandable antagonistic reasons against Mirabel from damaging the cracks in the broken family, all healed by the end, which was great the way it was, that it did work in that regard as we mentioned time and time again, because that idea was present from its beginning to the end of the film, with a logical reason for the characters to exist to get to their main plot. But that of course is an exception to the rule when immediately you go back to another film like Strange World, which hardly most people even remember anymore story-wise, considering how big that film failed, that lacked any major threat other than the toned down family conflict compared to Encanto that already did it beforehand. It is an adventure story with no real greater adventure or threat to oppose the main heroic figures at all, which doesn't sound like a true Disney movie in my opinion compared to other of the similar vein that actually had villains to counteract. They go on this journey and they learn with their main antagonistic force, which could be either good or bad, redeemed, or, you know, the typical grain of what Disney would be good at. And unfortunately, amongst other issues, that is also why the film failed ultimately. Which after that point, it just capped the entire era of questioning if Disney was really in the business of making villains a part of their stories or any in terms of their content these days, amidst doing things that were not of their own nature. Like it just felt that they weren't interested at all, and neither were we since the movie's qualities overall suffered greatly, culminating in a quick change with a mediocre release of Wish that rushed back into the classical image, which was grateful since that was the start of the comeback. Where yes, even though everything about it was done in the worst possible way and Magnifico really became a dud of a villain, at least they had something to say that they still did villains at all. Not that I'm completely giving them the benefit of the doubt in this situation, but with the original concepts and the basis of what could have been an evil character towards the end of that product of a movie, it still proved that they existed. That this was done to honor their legacy of 100 years of Disney, and that included the fact of what most people knew as villains, which did excite people in some very degree of what he could have brought, and still today is regarded as one of the best elements of Wish even though he sucks himself. That at the very least with such a reintroduction, despite being terrible and failing within the modern pathetic tropes they have done before, there is still a pathway forward for these main characters and a minor tribute notion to what we knew in the past. A past that we need to go back to explain you their grand importance and why this exciting future with the land is so great. Where at the very beginning of Disney, their grand importance cannot be understated, where these dastardly foes would do anything to retain or gain any power at all, with the evil queen and Snow White who seek to be the fairest of them all, and continuing that with more evil fairies and witches like Maleficent who can transform and revel in all that was evil, described as all the powers of hell. Where then you had grown-ups like Captain Hook who desired to defeat his nemesis Peter Pan, who represented timeless youth stopping his piracy or the cultivated image of what a grown-up is, and the Queen of Hearts demanding that her will be served or would have been off with your head. That either big or small without powers, Walt Disney's day of animated stories were full of rich dark characters that created timeless battles between the heroes that needed to be faced, the battle of good and evil that all great stories came from, and all children needed to learn to avoid the future paths of darkness. Every story had its purpose, and then later with the Renaissance you really understood this flavor quite well with new characters that are remained beloved today, like Ursula trying to trick Ariel with her deals to benefit herself to try to get what they want, Jafar seeking Genie to gain all cosmic powers with that attitude to rule Agrabah with his iron fist, Gaston admiring himself as the peak of a human figure, Scar wanting to take control after being passed over for some petty reasons of the royal bloodline, Frollo wanting to purge his own definition of wicked, selfishly using God to justify his own actions, and Hades who just hilariously wants to take over Olympus because he hates being in the dark ever since his brother put him in charge of that place. I mean, these aren't the best definitions I could give for these characters since I've done them in the past, and there are so much more I've left out in this picture, but you get the bigger idea of what I'm trying to go for, of what the Disney catalog had, that even during their darkest times when the company could have went under during the Dark Age with the Black Cauldron, they still had characters that were complete dark villains like the Horned King, who was attempted to be one of their most fearsome foes that they ever produced. Not saying he was quite frankly that good for a lackluster movie that had troubled development, but compared to something like Strange World in the present back in 2022, at least this had something that was made to justify a journey. They are the butter to the hero's bread, and everyone can at least recognize one singular foe when one movie comes to mind, where they're just a bigger part of the conversation of what people love about Disney storytelling. You can't just say you love a hero without loving a villain, no matter how simple or complex a story might be. What we should take away from this past is the real fact that they were almost necessary for most of these films to even breathe compared to say what other studios like Pixar has done, knowing their own identity to tell stories beyond having such characters that fits their own story aesthetic, which applies greatly to the feeling of this very same animation studio, that villains have to exist. So when they stop for the most part without having the variety of some stories that have works like Encanto, it just falls apart for them. The movies crumble into dust in terms of box office and critical reviews to the point that it never existed in the mainstream mind. You hardly even see merch for Strange World, to be honest. At least they tried to bring it back during their anniversary with Wish and had some credible ideas for other villains to return in the future. Not that I think they will appear in future films slated to come, but how it culminates in the biggest, most desired new attraction that Disney has to offer. So now, with all of that said, we have to circle back to the benchmark announcement of Villains Land that entails a whole new world. No pun intended. Yes, I'm aware there are many difficulties with things like this and such a concept and how people derive from it and how such a concept will be utilized, but that preview does have this feeling of optimism above all reason. Because another thing to mention while adding this is what is sending Disney fans into a new divide, like always within the concept of Cars in Frontierland, which is removing another beloved piece of the Magic Kingdom being their own Rivers of America, a centerpiece of this land attributed to the pioneers of the past representing the frontier of new adventures for a young country, now replaced by a modern Cars Pixar franchise attractions that paves over such a tranquil era that is just lost so that they could actually solve this pathway crisis they need for such what a new land would entail. And to be honest with you, it's something that makes me mixed too on those feelings, even though this video is trying to actually portray the villains coming back in the park, since it's become a huge piece of Disney history in terms of their theme parks, and what has been regarded of the theming of such theme parks. The other reason I wanted to talk about this and expand a lot more on this part especially is because since I am a Disney fan, I really do care about the theme parks, hence why I created this entire video in the first place, even though we're talking about villains and you expected probably more news on animation since they are doing these things. But I just really care and I want to actually include more new ways for you guys to enjoy. which adding these new cars concept rides do seem great and scenic, but it does continue this dire trend that needs to be discussed of weird IP being shoved in places in their own parks that disrupt the harmony and theme of a certain era or part. Yet of course, there are arguments that it's not really been used much like Disneyland's version, which is an integral piece of beauty on its own in Walt Disney's original park, where if they were to remove that, I really will question to still be a Disney fan if that can actually tell you something, considering how far I actually go and still praise them today. But for what they want and what is required, this felt like such a necessary plan to continue bringing in villains, which sadly and ironically, in a way to bring villains, Disney themselves become villains to the eyes of their own fans, especially to the Florida parks who love this certain aspect of other things in the past like to mention, but done so in the age-old question of dead ends of that very park that cannot be accomplished with how their own river system works, that is not able to be maintained well enough to even continue unless major work is required to rebuild that whole land connected to a larger lagoon. Logistically, a complete nightmare in their opinion. And of course, it's something the executives consider their usage of how people spend their days over there, thinking in terms of how they make money, which of course is the sad truth. It's a conflict that isn't easy to write out, but one that has to be done and feels more kinetic energy offered, with even the concept art including several smaller streams and rivers that won't take a whole lot of the beauty and what more people can have fun with, the concept still being exciting for what people to come. And then again, what happens from this recording is yet to be seen, and more focused on the point of the promise of what Villains Land can bring to the company, where I cannot have all the answers or know too much as what others would feel by substance, and I'm not the smartest or brightest on this subject. But I guarantee you, within the themes of the Magic Kingdom and the coming age of Disney, such a change was really needed to show us that they do care about villains in some way, even though we couldn't be sure it's another response to the Dark Universe aspect of Epic Universe that people will clamor and debate for to see soon enough, a topic many people can have a great opinion rather than what has happened to the Disney parks or the last few years of the continued age-old argument that I have presented on this channel of Disney versus Universal, or more specifically what I've done in Disney versus DreamWorks. Of course, trying to continue the bitter wars that we just have to find ourselves in, but one that I have to question each single day. But just looking at what pictures like this in the near future brings more encouragement of more slimy devils appearing once again like our heroes did in the golden and revival ages of Disney, rather than pointless twist or none of them at all. That we can truly say that right now there is a great rebirth of villains in our own media, especially in Disney that we all love, that has come upon us, whether it be both in theme parks or in future movies, that provides a breath of fresh air that is deliciously evil and encourages the combat to fight for the good of it all. And the words and statements means that return to darkness that is very much needed, that brings that classical fairy tale feeling that we all fell in love with. Whatever the future might be, I cannot wait to take this journey with you down the winding road of thorny based deals. And I'm all done. Goodbye.